In this episode, we're going to take a step that sounds boring at first, but it's the step that decides whether risk management actually works in real life. Documenting what risks were agreed to, what issues were found, what treatments were chosen, and who is accountable for what happens next. New learners often imagine that the hard part is identifying risks, but in most organizations, the harder part is making sure decisions do not vanish after a meeting. If a risk is accepted, reduced, or transferred, that is a decision with consequences, and the organization needs a clear record of what was decided, why it was decided, and what conditions must be monitored. Documentation is not meant to punish people or create paperwork for its own sake. It is meant to create memory and clarity in an environment where staff change, systems evolve, and priorities shift. When documentation and accountability are done well, teams can move faster because they do not have to re-argue the same decisions every time something changes. By the end, you should understand what needs to be documented, how to keep it useful instead of bloated, and how to manage it over time so risk decisions stay current and responsible. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful starting point is to separate the words risk and issue because they are related but not identical. A risk is about what could happen, like a possible future incident, where you consider likelihood and impact. An issue is something that is already true and already observable, like a known weakness, a missing control, an expired certificate, or an overdue patch, even if it has not caused harm yet. Issues often create risks, but treating an issue list as a risk list can be misleading because not every issue carries the same impact or urgency. In documentation, it helps to record both, the issue as a factual condition and the risk as the potential harm pathway that condition enables. This distinction prevents arguments where one person says it is only a small issue while another says it is a huge risk, because you can acknowledge the condition and then evaluate the consequence separately. For beginners, the big idea is that risk language helps you prioritize, while issue language helps you track facts and fixes. When you document a risk decision, you are capturing a specific scenario and a specific choice about how to treat it. The scenario should be clear enough that a new person joining the team later can understand what asset is involved, what could go wrong, and what impact matters most. The treatment should be stated in practical terms, such as mitigate with defined controls, accept with monitoring, avoid by changing the plan, or transfer through an agreement. The reason for the decision should also be recorded, because this is what makes the decision defensible later. Maybe mitigation was chosen because the potential impact exceeded tolerance, or acceptance was chosen because the cost of mitigation was too high relative to the impact. Documentation that captures the why is far more valuable than documentation that only captures the what, because the why is what helps future teams judge whether the decision still makes sense when conditions change. Agreed risk documentation also needs to capture residual risk, meaning what remains after the treatment is applied. If mitigation reduces risk, it rarely drives it to zero, and the remaining exposure should be described so that leadership knows what they are still living with. If a compensating control is used, the documentation should explain how the substitute provides comparable protection and what limitations remain. If risk is transferred, the documentation should clarify what is truly transferred and what stays, because reputational harm and legal obligations often remain even when some costs are shifted. Residual risk is a key part of accountability because it frames what the organization has consciously decided to tolerate. For a beginner, this is the difference between a plan that feels complete and a plan that is actually transparent about trade-offs. Now let's talk about treatments, because treatment plans are where documentation turns into work. A treatment plan should specify what action will be taken, what success looks like, and what timeline or milestones are expected. It should also identify who is responsible for execution, because a plan with no owner is just an idea. Responsibility should be clear enough that it does not become a group problem that belongs to everyone and therefore to no one. If the treatment includes operational changes, such as adding monitoring or improving recovery readiness, The plan should also specify who will operate the control after it is implemented. Beginners sometimes assume implementation is the finish line, but in security, operation is often where controls fail because people move on and the new behavior does not stick. A well-documented treatment plan anticipates that reality and makes ongoing ownership explicit. Accountability is not the same as blame, and it helps to say that clearly because people often fear documentation for that reason. Accountability means there is a named person or role responsible for ensuring a decision is carried out and reviewed, not that they personally caused the risk. In healthy programs, accountability creates clarity about who can approve what and who must take action when thresholds are crossed. If a risk is accepted, accountability includes who accepted it and who must reevaluate it later. If an issue is opened, accountability includes who will remediate it or who will decide to accept the resulting risk. When accountability is vague, problems tend to drift, and drifting is dangerous because risks become normal in the background. Beginners should learn that accountability is what turns risk work into a living practice rather than a one-time report. Good documentation also includes review rules, because time changes the truth. A risk accepted 6 months ago might no longer be acceptable because the system now handles more sensitive data or because exposure increased. A mitigation plan that was reasonable last year might now be insufficient because threat patterns changed or because new dependencies were added. This is why risk documentation often includes a review date, an expiration date for exceptions, or triggers that require reassessment, like significant changes to the system or to its environment. Review rules protect the organization from forgetfulness, which is one of the most common causes of security failure. They also support fairness, because teams can see that exceptions are temporary and managed rather than permanent privileges. For beginners, the key habit is to treat risk decisions as time-bound commitments that must be revisited, not as permanent labels. Managing agreed risks and issues also requires a way to keep documentation organized so it can be used, not just stored. If the record is scattered across emails and meeting notes, it becomes impossible to find what was decided, and people revert to memory or opinion. A centralized record creates a single source of truth, and it also enables reporting, trend analysis, and oversight. Organization matters because risks often overlap across systems, and without visibility, you might treat the same type of problem repeatedly without addressing root causes. For example, if many issues involve unclear ownership or inconsistent classification, the deeper problem might be governance rather than technology. A managed record helps you spot patterns like that, which can lead to improvements that reduce many risks at once. Another important element is linking risks, issues, and treatments so that the story stays connected. If an issue is logged as a factual weakness, the risk entry should reference that issue so anyone reading can see what condition created the risk. If a treatment is planned, it should reference the risk it is meant to reduce so you can later evaluate whether it worked. Without links, documentation becomes a pile of separate notes that do not tell a coherent story. With links, the organization can answer practical questions like, which risks depend on this issue, which issues are most tied to high-impact risks, and which treatments are reducing the most serious exposures. Beginners do not need to memorize formal frameworks to understand this. They just need to see that connected records support learning and control improvement over time. A frequent challenge is deciding how much detail to document, because too little detail creates confusion, while too much detail creates clutter. The goal is to document enough to support future decision-making without drowning the record in unnecessary complexity. A good rule of thumb is that the documentation should allow someone who was not in the meeting to understand the risk scenario, the chosen treatment, the reason, the owner, the timeline, and the review conditions. It should also be clear about assumptions, such as how criticality was determined or what exposure was considered. If you cannot state assumptions, later readers may not know whether the decision is still valid because the assumptions might have changed. The right level of detail is the level that preserves intent and accountability, not the level that tries to capture every possible technical nuance. Finally, documentation and management support organizational trust, because trust grows when decisions are visible and consistent. When teams see that risks are recorded, reviewed, and owned, they become more willing to raise concerns early rather than hiding them. When leaders see that accepted risks are tracked and revisited, they become more comfortable making pragmatic decisions rather than demanding unrealistic perfection. When auditors or oversight groups ask what happened and why, a clear record reduces panic and reduces the temptation to rewrite history. Most importantly, when an incident occurs, documentation helps the organization respond calmly because it can quickly identify what risks were known, what treatments were in progress, and what residual risk was consciously accepted. This is not about protecting reputations. It is about protecting the organization's ability to learn and improve. To conclude, documenting and managing agreed risks, issues, treatments, and accountability is how risk management becomes a repeatable, trustworthy practice instead of a series of disconnected conversations. Risks describe possible harmful outcomes. Issues describe factual conditions. Treatments describe what will be done, and accountability describes who will ensure the decisions stay real over time. Reliable documentation captures the scenario, the decision, the rationale, the residual risk, the owner, the timeline, and the review conditions in a way that future teams can understand and act on. Managing that documentation means keeping it centralized, connected, current, and focused on what supports decisions rather than on what creates clutter. If you learn this discipline early, you will notice a major shift. Instead of security feeling like endless debate, it starts to feel like controlled choices with clear ownership and clear follow-through. That is the point of documentation, and it is why this topic matters so much for the certification.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.